The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the Prime Minister.
We were given a referendum on whether to remain or leave the European Union.
I will never send troops anywhere in a mission of that kind.
Get us Hillary Clinton's emails.
I'd be very pleased to know what they think they're doing. I think they're all insane.
Ladies and gents, welcome to another episode of Hidden Perspective. This is Rob Greco. It's good to be back exactly a week after my previous episode release. As promised, I do want to get into a weekly episode schedule for you. So consider this keeping up the momentum. So let's see how long I can keep that going for. So before I get into the episode, I do just want to quickly say, if you are getting value out of these, you do enjoy listening to them, please let some family members know, let some friends know, help me spread the word. That would be much appreciated. Now, as you may or may not be aware, my home state is Victoria, Australia. Now, I don't happen to be living there, but Victoria has actually undergone one of the strictest, most intense, and the longest lockdowns in the world, despite the fact that it actually hasn't had a lot of the COVID virus circulating. So to discuss this, I've decided to interview one of my longstanding friends, Julian Angelatos, who used to be a world-class debater for Melbourne University. He's now a musician. So in the course of this interview, Jules and I discuss actually what happened to Victoria, some of the policy failures, and then we kind of dive deeper into some more abstract, I guess, philosophical ideas around the government's role in a pandemic and whether it has the ability to lock down its citizens. It's a far and wide-ranging discussion, so I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. I now bring you the interview. Okay, Julian Angelatos, welcome to the Hidden Perspective podcast. It's good to have you on.
It's great to finally be on.
All right, so I wanted to get you on to the podcast for a couple of reasons. First, you're a Victorian and you're living in some of the one of the harshest and strictest lockdowns in the world. And the second reason is you're a longstanding friend who is an original and clear thinker, so I really value your opinion on the topic. So I appreciate you coming on to the pod.
Thank you, mate. And can I just say your intro track really pumps. So
a little known fact is Jules was the pioneer of the intro song. So if you're a fan of that, as many people have come up to me and said they are, you have Jules to thank. All right, Jules.
Have they actually?
They have. Some people have commented how.
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, they're big fans. But all right, so Jules, I want to paint a picture. So you and I are both Victorians. You're living in Victoria, Australia. I happen to be living in Alberta, Canada. Pretty much since July here in Alberta, which has a population of, I think it's maybe 1.5 million fewer people than Victoria. Alberta's population is around 4 million people. We've had cases ranging from 100 to now 300 cases a day since the middle of July. But we've been living under pretty normal conditions. Everything isn't back to normal, but most things are. You can have 50 people indoors, 200 people outdoors. Masks are mandatory inside, depending on the city or the community you live in. But generally, things are back to normal. The only thing you can't go to are like big sporting events or concerts. Whereas you, on the other hand, happen to be living in a state with a greater population. And in the last couple of days, you guys have 10 cases a day, 12 cases a day?
Yeah, I think the 2-week rolling average just popped over 10 yesterday. So
right.
It's 2-week average of 10 a day.
But in saying that, you're living under still some pretty restrictive conditions. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I never spent time working out how to diagnose lack of freedom. But yeah, we're talking about, I can't go further than 5 kilometers from my house unless it's for very specific reasons, like to get healthcare or to go to my job. Having said that, most forms of employment aren't currently legal. So they've got definitions of essential workers, and if you can't really do your job, even if it's within the 5 kilometres, you can't have anyone over at your house at all, unless you're single. And if you're single, you're allowed to create a bubble between you and one other person who comes and visits. You can only see one other household outside in a public space, and that can be a maximum of 5 people. So, I've got 3 roommates. I've got two housemates. We could catch up with 2 people from the same house outside at a park or something for 2 hours.
Right.
Yeah. So you can't go to any. Most retail's closed. Sort of all retail outside of essential retail's closed. Like it's yeah. So I wouldn't say it's pretty strict. I would say it's. I would have called this some sort of Armageddon last year. Yeah.
You're pretty much the furthest thing from back to normal still at this stage, even though cases over the last week have gone down to, even some days I've noticed Victoria had single digit cases. So
yeah, I think today's 7.
Okay, so there's a pretty extreme disparity in the approaches that Victoria's taken, and the province that I'm living in Canada, Alberta, has taken, like many other jurisdictions around the world. So just to give some people context, especially those who aren't listening to this from Victoria, or you haven't heard of what's been going on in Victoria, Australia. So to give a timeline of events, on January 25th, Victoria received the first COVID case in Australia. So if anything, it should have been more prepared than other states and territories. In late March, Victoria enacted its first lockdown, along with pretty much the rest of Australia and most of the world. And that lockdown lasted 8 weeks. And then in early June, restrictions eased up as cases went down in Victoria, along with the rest of the country. So Victoria and Australia had successfully flattened the curve, as they say. But then on June 20th, Victoria reinstated some new restrictions in certain postcodes, as Victoria was the only state to see an uptick in cases. And roughly at this time, we learned that hotel quarantine was an absolute shambles. So Victoria was the only state in Australia not to accept the Australian Defence Force's support in managing hotel quarantine. Instead, the Victorian government opted for private security guards, and these security guards did a terrible job. Some of them had sex with people in quarantine, believe it or not, and then that led to further community spread. Then on July 7th, Premier Daniel Andrews reintroduces a lockdown for the entire Melbourne metro area, as well as the Mitchell Shire. On July 23rd, masks become mandatory. On August the 2nd, Premier Andrews declares a state of disaster, and he escalated restrictions into a stage 4 lockdown, which was to last 6 weeks. This is when Victorians got something like a curfew and some of those really restrictive measures that Jules touched on. Then after that 6-week period, September 14th, Andrews introduces a 3-step reopen based on achieving case number targets. That first step went into effect on September 14th. In saying this, many restrictions are still in place. They still have things like the curfew, the 5-kilometre rule, essential shopping. Then on September 28th, Victoria moved to the second step after the 14-day case average had fallen below 50 cases. Now, currently, as Jules was touching on briefly just before, Melbourne is still in the second step of this. Many of those restrictions are still in place. Jules and his fellow Victorians can only get to stage 3 of the reopen once the daily case average over the past 14 days is less than 5 cases. And then there's another rule that there have to be less than 5 cases with an unknown source over the past 14 days. And then when Victoria is in step 3, it can only then proceed to the last step if there are no cases in the community over a 14-day period. But it's actually not really the last step, because then you can only proceed to the next stage, which is they call COVID normal, when there are no cases over a 28-day period. So just to give a summation, just to highlight how insane this is, in total, Victorians have spent 22 weeks under strict lockdown, which is 154 days as of today, and rising, we can at least expect Victorians to be in this lockdown for a few more weeks unless Dan Andrews reconsiders his reopen plan. And note that this was only 8 weeks with the rest of Australia. It's been 14 extra weeks of lockdown, just Victoria alone. So while the rest of Australia has pretty much returned back to normal and has enjoyed a lot of the freedoms that Victorians no longer get to enjoy, Victorians have been alone in this. So, Jules, do you think I missed anything in terms of that timeline of events?
So I add a couple of details. So the first I'd add is when all of Australia sort of went into a lockdown, there really wasn't any of the virus in the community. So the virus was coming from returning travellers from overseas. So Australians who had been overseas, particularly the United States and Europe, coming home and bringing the virus with them. So once the governments had worked out that that's where the virus was going to come, they started testing and quarantining people coming home. So we would see, like, every day we would see all these numbers, 20, 30, 40, and, that's where South Australia, Western Australia, all these other states in Australia had their cases. But I think it's important to point out that really outside of Victoria, and you could probably say a little incident that happened in Tasmania and a little incident that happened in New South Wales, there wasn't any community transmission in Australia. So, and I think that's the really important thing. So it was clear that the virus was coming from overseas, in the same way that New Zealand. So what you had on June 20, in March, was a lockdown with the rest of Australia. And that lockdown was I think it was called stage 3 at the time. It's not as awful as what I'm currently experiencing, but it was really intense. But I think the point I'd make there is that, all these businesses were shut down, obviously, our freedoms are crazily limited, our ability to socialize, all this stuff that happens as a consequence of lockdown was done basically as an insurance policy against the virus spreading from people returning home from overseas. Right. What does it say about a government? And if you're interested in the politics here, Victoria was compelled the other states and the federal government to go down a really strict lockdown path. So on one side, you've got, this issue is huge. The consequences might be a disaster. So the proportionate thing to do is to destroy all these freedoms, all this economic freedom, and we're going to be really blunt instrument on one side. Right. And then of course, what's the actual issue? The actual issue is keeping people who have this virus returning from overseas outside of the community. And the Victorian government's response was to defer that responsibility to private security guards, hired casually, poorly trained. And that was the reason why we had such awful community spread. So you've got, I guess, it's if the issue is so serious that all of our freedoms need to be destroyed and emergency measures need to be taken by a government, then you would hope that a reciprocal response is used in, the actual material management of the virus, which was those hotels, and it wasn't.
If you're going to expect every citizen to obey by the rules and do their part, put simply, then you need to do your part, which is quarantine and contact tracing and some really key tools in pandemic management. Right. It seems like a pretty reciprocal agreement. Now, Jules, before we get into just touching on some of those lockdown rules, full disclosure here that this isn't a partisan attack. It isn't as if Jules and I happen to be these big Liberal Party fans. And just to give context to the international listeners, that the Liberal Party is the centre-right party in Australia, whereas the Labor Party is the centre-left party, and Dan Andrews whose premier is a Labor politician. So that just gives you some context. Jules is definitely the furthest thing from a Liberal Party hack who's going to come out and onto this podcast just for the sake of scoring political points for the Liberal Party. So full disclosure there. So Jules, I just want to turn to some of those lockdown rules. So you did touch on those in your intro, and the thing that would probably be really striking for international listeners are a couple of those rules. So the first one, the 5 kilometer radius, the curfews, and the fines. So, I've lived in both British Columbia and Alberta throughout the pandemic, 2 Canadian provinces, and we went under lockdowns. During the first lockdown in March, April, May, I was in British Columbia. And just the idea that you would have this police state come in, issuing, fines in the thousands of dollars for breaching a certain 5 kilometer rule or a curfew is just completely insane. And I think this is a point that a lot of Victorians and even Australians don't really understand, is that the measures and the authoritarianism with which these lockdown rules have come into play isn't common amongst comparable liberal democratic, even social democratic countries. So, is this, have you actually noticed, amongst your fellow Victorians, an awareness of how strict these measures are relative to somewhere like Canada, the US, or Europe?
No. But and so it's like, I should have made, sorry, I was trying to make this point before, and so I want to go back to it. So the point I made before about the fact that pretty much the rest of Australia outside of Victoria didn't have widespread community transmission.
Right.
And so what that did was it created the opportunity, which pretty much all the states in Victoria have followed up on, of exterminating the virus. So basically having entirely community-free, like the virus just not being in the community at all, right?
Get on top of it, act early, and you're fine. Sure.
Yeah, so, Australia
seems like a noble goal in the beginning.
Australia's miles away from everywhere else in the world, and, just like New Zealand was able to, pretty much all of Australia was able to just, have this virus be a non-issue. Yeah, there's like, there was 60, there's going to be 60,000 people at the Gabba in Brisbane, watching the AFL Grand Final soon. Like, most of Australia's, not experiencing this at all in the same way Victoria is. So what that does, though, is it makes, because we want this exterminated from the community, and then the whole, is the government being transparent about this? I would say no, but that's a separate discussion. Let's just say, based on their metrics, no virus for a month.
Right.
I think we can call that, I think no virus for a month or no virus for 2 weeks, whatever the WHO, World Health Organization definition of extermination is, whatever, elimination. The point is, we have no tolerance for the virus. So I think that was what I was trying to say before, that as a country, we have no tolerance for this virus, to the extent that all these states have closed their borders on Victoria because Victoria has, too much of this virus going on in the community. They don't want any community transmission of this virus. Australians don't want this virus, or Australian governments don't want this virus. And unlike these other liberal democratic countries,
right,
which is the response to your question, that's a reasonable possibility. Whereas I think the fact that Canada shares a border with the United States,
right,
such an important border, means that Canadians can't reasonably expect to get rid of this virus, right? So I think that creates the context in which all this is possible. So, and I think that's such an important point that Victoria's had 815 people or something die of the virus, just over 800 people,
right?
But we've experienced one of the worst lockdowns anywhere in the world. Now that's because we're not trying to to keep the costs of having this. We're not implementing lockdowns as a way to have a reasonable level of this virus. We're implementing lockdowns to get rid of the virus.
Right. And okay, so in saying that, are your fellow Victorians, your friends, your family members, are they all aware that this is an overtly elimination-based strategy, and they're okay with the extreme violation of their freedoms? Or do you think that they've been lied to by the Victorian government, who's at some stages said all they need to do is flatten the curve, mitigate, and ensure that the healthcare system isn't going to get overwhelmed? In other words, what I'm really asking is the average guy on the street okay with what's happening because they're simply happy to embrace these measures to eliminate the virus, or is there some pretty strong resistance?
Look, it's interesting. Like when the second major lockdown was announced, I had to get some medical treatment from, a specialist surgeon, and, he was just appalled, by what they were doing, and, thought it was just outrageous, thought, this is an elimination strategy. And, he was basically saying that, he had seen such a massive decline in appointments from people that he was going to be dealing with, way more incurable cancers next year, and that the cost of all this wasn't being taken into account. So that was an example. But look, Rob, I think part of people's experience, like when governments decide to do things, people take. So, for example, I feel like the government decides to drastically change your life. You can't see your friends. Maybe you've lost employment. You're stuck working from home. So all of a sudden your life is full of challenges, and your 5 cents worth of an opinion on the issue isn't necessarily very practical or helpful. I'm sure that my eagerness to politically and philosophically inquire during this period has contributed to, worse mental health for myself. Like I spoke to my dad about it, and some of the laws they were trying to pass in terms of, arbitrary detention from, you could all of a sudden get arrested arbitrarily by a health department official, and I was talking to my dad. My dad's a lawyer, right? And my dad cares a lot about this stuff. And I spoke to my dad about it, and my dad was really transparent, and he was like, look, Jules, I haven't really been spending too much time caring about all this stuff. I've been trying to just focus on the positives. Now that probably your psychologist is probably going to tell you that, oh, look, you can't, focus on what you can control, not what you can't control. And, Robin, so why worry about the politics when you have no control of it? Try to make positive things out of it. So I think most people are doing that. Like their lives have been blown up. Everyone's mental health has been massacred and destroyed. And I feel like most people just want to focus on how they're going to get through it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so as you were just mentioning there, that was the omnibus bill. Can you just give people a little bit more context as to what this is? Or I believe it's almost been passed. Potentially there was some...
No, it failed.
It failed?
The crossbench... No, it's been amended. It's passed but amended. Okay. So I think it was passed last night. Yeah. But it was amended. Basically, the Victorian Bar Council, the Australian Bar Council, a bunch of judges, including High Court judges, I'm pretty sure. So, barristers in Australia are, I think people know what, all these independent, lawyer councils basically said that a proposed legislation by the government was way over the top and, challenged, went further, was basically violating our human rights and democratic rights under the law. And basically the government wanted to be able to assign powers to health department people, but it was a really broad definition of who could have the powers. And basically if a health department official reasonably, so some bureaucrat had a reasonable belief that you were going to break COVID rules, right? They could detain you for like 2 weeks and
So a person didn't actually need to break the rules. So let's say it was a curfew, but if there was a suspicion that this person would break the rules, they could be detained. So not only are we handing over detention powers to unelected officials and to someone who isn't a member of the police force, but we're also handing over those powers to detain someone for not even committing a crime.
Right. And so so you go, okay, it depends from what perspective you look at this. If you look at this from the perspective of we need to get rid of the virus entirely, all of these measures start to make more sense. They might, you might not reach a point where you go, oh, this is still acceptable, but your margin for error in a situation where you need this virus entirely removed from the community is really, really small. So yeah, these extermination, this elimination, I should probably say elimination, whatever. This set of policies, particularly after community transmissions unfortunately happened,
right,
which was the case in Victoria, they create the context for all of this. Yeah. So
Yep.
this is how this happens. Yeah, I mean, to me that was appalling, but it's been appalling that the whole time during COVID, state of emergency and state of disaster powers have been enacted, which basically allows a copper to walk into any house he wants to.
Right. Yeah, I've seen a few of those videos of. There was one fairly widely publicized case of a lady who posted a anti-lockdown protest event on Facebook. She was a pregnant woman, and there's video of 2 police officers coming into her home and arresting her for merely posting a anti-lockdown protest. And funnily enough, I actually looked at that Facebook event, and that was... So the media latched onto that as if this person was claiming that COVID was a hoax, that this person was an anti-vaxxer, this person was a 5G conspiracy theorist. And in fact, if you just took a minute to read the Facebook event, it said, we believe COVID is very serious. We want everyone who attends this protest to wear a mask, but we simply believe that the cost of lockdown exceeds the cost of the virus. Something pretty sensible, one would have thought. But there was this hysteria to not only for the police to crack down on her, but for also the media to label anyone who could potentially hold a view that's critical of lockdowns as some absolute crackpot. So, and I'm guessing a lot of this has been happening because I think there was an anti-lockdown protest 3 weeks ago. Only 100 people attended it, and the police cracked down and issued many arrests and even more fines. Is that right? Yeah. So there's pretty much no... And even though back in, when was it, May, June, July, whenever it was, there was a BLM protest that took place in Melbourne with thousands of people, and nobody dared to crack down on that. What's happening in Victoria? Why is there that inconsistency, and why is there this eagerness, this willingness to take away something as vital as your right to protest?
Yeah, so it happens. I was thinking about this last night. What you have is there's a context for it that is enables it. And so I think the context is, as Australians, we were watching the news every night, and we watched, those northern parts of Italy just get decimated, parts of Europe get decimated. We saw those, really emotional press conferences where the governor of New York State just being devastated by his lack of ventilators, and
right.
We saw parts of the world in genuine crisis as a consequence of the virus, and as such we saw those jurisdictions around the world implement lockdown, right? And the collection of policies we call lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what that does is I'm pretty sure at the worst periods of what was going on in New York, ambulances weren't available for people who were having heart attacks and things, right? And there was, I remember watching reports of ambos, working double shifts every day, basically sleeping in their sleeping in their ambulance, and all kinds of crazy stuff going on as a consequence of the health system over there being totally overwhelmed.
Yeah, of course.
Now that creates a context and a normalization of things. It also creates an opportunity for politicians to potentially manipulate that context. And so in Australia, in Victoria rather, every time Daniel Andrews has initiated another level of lockdown, it basically sounds like this. These are really hard decisions, but what's a harder decision is deciding who gets a ventilator and who doesn't. What's a harder decision is deciding who gets care and who doesn't. What's a harder decision is not saying that you can't go to a party. It's saying you're not going to get treated for your disease because our hospitals are full. And I think a key instrument that's been used that when I've had discussions with friends about this is that, the difference between Andrews doing what he, Victoria going down this path or not is us turning into, those jurisdictions that were just destroyed and overwhelmed. And I think that's just a total falsification of what's going on. And I think I feel like on balance, I also think that part of the reason why as Victorians we've been willing to put up with such an awful level of lockdown, even though it should be used as a reason against it, is like, oh, well, look, we're so lucky we're not like those places, and because we've decided to sacrifice our convenience and our liberty and our economy and whatever else, we haven't ended up like those places, but so I don't think that's, but that's not right, is it? Because we could choose to put up with, a level of the virus that doesn't decimate the health system, but still allows for a lot more freedom. We're choosing not to do that.
Okay. That does provide a bit more context for me going from the outside. But okay, so before we get into more of these abstract issues, which I do want to discuss with you, let's go through the policy failures in a bit more detail. So the first one is hotel quarantine, right? So it's believed that virtually, 95 to 98% of all deaths have been attributed to the hotel quarantine scandal. But there's an ongoing investigation as to who actually wished to use private contractors and refused the offer from the ADF. So how do you assess this policy failure?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear, isn't it? There should have been, like I said, the issue is serious enough that we're going to implement, at least for Victoria, world first levels of restrictions on liberties, restrictions on trading, restrictions on freedom. So the issue could not be more serious based on that level of government intervention. But, the same seckies that, stop you from crowd surfing at, a festival are the people entrusted with, protecting the spread of the virus.
Right.
I mean, like the equivalent.
It just doesn't add up.
No, it should have been fucking Navy SEALs. It should have been like the most sophisticated, best trained people in Australia right now for this purpose, being there, making sure, because it turns out that the costs of community transmission is a whole entire state suffering an extra, 20 weeks of lockdown. So it should have been like, any company does risk assessments and looks at, okay, where can we be ruined here? Let's just make sure that the place where it's most likely things can go wrong doesn't go wrong, and let's put a crazy amount of effort into stopping that. So in terms of making sure that the community, if it did spread, didn't spread it too much, we did that. We destroyed the ability for the community to spread anything by removing its mobility and all of that. Did we do a proportional level of that with hotel quarantine? No. So every other state. Yeah. So, I mean, like it's one of the dumbest, stupidest, most profoundly depressing failures of government I can ever think of, which points to the nature of government, which is something else I'd like to talk about. But
Right.
Governments aren't perfect, and in this instance, they were disgraceful.
Right. Fair enough. So another one of those government failures is contract tracing. So I learned that the Victorian government sent a fact-finding team of contract tracers to New South Wales only in mid-September. So as I mentioned in the beginning, Victoria was the first state in Australia to receive a COVID case. And it turns out that we're doing a terrible job with contract tracing, and they only had the awareness to learn how to actually do this properly in the middle of September.
Yeah, I mean, like that. Yeah, look, Andrews would argue, the Victorian Premier would argue that after that inquiry, that fact-finding mission, they ended up, he reckons it showed that they were doing everything well. I don't know. There's
Right.
the Australian Medical Association, which is like the key body of doctors in Australia. They've said that the contact tracing in Victoria is shit, and that the whole health department in Victoria sucks.
Right.
The federal government has said that Victoria sucks, that the Victorian health department sucks. I don't know. Does the health department suck? Probably. Do government bodies suck? Probably.
Right.
It looked like our ability to handle outbreaks has been poor. I don't know. I'm not an expert on this. All I know is I used to work for the Melbourne Exhibition and Convention Centre, and we were paid by the state government of Victoria, and we were the most inefficient, over bureaucratic,
Bloated,
wasteful
Right.
government arm and employer I've ever worked for ever. So I'm assuming the rest of the government's like that, but I don't know.
Yeah, sure. Fair enough. Well, okay. And then so speaking of this overly complicated bureaucratic arm of government, it also turns out that another failure from Andrews has been that he lied about the basis for his very unpopular curfew. So Victoria only had curfew in the second lockdown. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first curfew you guys had was from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. And then the second curfew after one of those reopen phases came in was 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. And so to give people an idea, it turns out that Andrew said that this was needed to protect the community and slow down transmission. And it turns out that the chief medical officer didn't recommend it. And then when I went back to Andrews asking, well, then why did you put it in? He said, well, we needed it because it was requested of us by the police force. And then it turns out that the head of police said they didn't ask for the curfew. So what's going on here?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it seems obviously the curfew was dropped a couple of weeks ago. I mean, you're the lawyer but out of the two of us. So, but I believe that there's a level of confidence that the lawsuit against the government to remove the curfew was going to be successful.
Absolutely.
Whether that's people wanting to defer their responsibility for implementing it. I mean, I don't know. I'm pretty confident that the curfew, if it wasn't recommended by the police or the chief health officer, what I do know is that I'm certain it was effective. Just like all of these draconian measures are effective because, if you were on the road past curfew, you felt really uncomfortable.
Right.
So,
but then on the flip side, if this curfew is in place and then everyone has to do their shopping by 8 p.m., doesn't that in turn mean that the stores are more crowded because you're reducing the available time for people to actually shop, which in turn increases crowding?
Hey, look, maybe. All I know is that I think the people like catching up with their friends, and I think probably the version of breaking the rules in COVID was, maybe having one or two friends over in the evening, and getting pissed and whatever else and having a good time at night.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it made everyone feel less comfortable about doing that. So I think if you were a rule breaker, then you were going to, probably just make sure you went over to your friend's house before that curfew and then spent the night there. So, I mean, look, I don't know. I mean, in terms of deciding, what's most effective, what isn't most effective. Yeah. What the Chinese did, if someone had the virus and they just welded their fucking doors shut, I'm pretty sure that's effective too.
That can be effective. Exactly.
It's whether it, should it be happening or not?
Yeah.
Effectiveness is one part of that equation.
I think this is another thing that I wanted to talk about, which is that you could justify any measure on the basis that it's effective, right?
Sure.
You could put
totally.
everyone in solitary confinement, have the army deliver them food and medicine. People wouldn't get to see their loved ones for 7 days, but hey, the virus would be eliminated. Does that mean we want to put everyone into solitary confinement? Of course not. So I think
But that's an example of the discussions that are vigorously had within the media. So Rob and I, before we started recording, were talking about the function of the media. Maybe we'll go back to it, but that's an example of what does get crazy amount of airtime. So, for example, articles about epidemiologists putting forward what they think are the most effective measures and whether this measure is more effective than that measure, whether that measure is more effective than this measure. Now, that is stuff that's discussed in infinite detail in Australia right now. So the effectiveness of things, right? And those discussions are had without a calibration and consideration of the costs. Right. So that those kind of debates go on endlessly and have been going on endlessly. The effectiveness of this versus the effectiveness of that versus the modeling of this versus the modeling of that. And all of those articles don't then have, we also factor into the account that this will, that this measure compared to this measure results in this much more financial hardship, this much more social isolation, this much more suicide and depression compared to this much suicide and depression and economic hardship. I don't ever read those on those articles. What I read is an epidemiologist saying that this would be more effective or that would be more effective at getting rid of the virus. And that's sort of as far as these articles go. But there's endless amounts of debate about that.
Do you get articles and debate about the fact that ICU capacity never exceeded 3.2% in Victoria? Because Andrews is always claiming that these insanely authoritarian measures are needed because, hey, if we don't do this, you won't get your healthcare. And it's always framed as a healthcare system constraint, when in fact, at the peak level of virus in Victoria, ICU capacity wasn't even at 5%. It was at, I think the highest it ever got to was 3.1%. Have people ever brought that up?
No, because again, as a country, no government has explicitly said, including the federal government, that we're going for elimination. And I think that's because what it does is it creates criteria that they've self-established that can then be used against them, and they can be pointed as, well, you're failing because you haven't eliminated it, right?
You haven't eliminated it. And also the fact that there was a level of community transmission, say in June, July, which necessitated a much earlier enactment of the lockdowns, right?
In Victoria?
Yeah, so at the stage where Victoria in kind of June, July was getting, 20, 30, 40 cases a day, if elimination were the strategy all along, you would have implemented almost as Jacinda Ardern has done in New Zealand. As soon as there was one case, everyone back to lockdown because it's an overt elimination strategy. But Victoria didn't do that, right? No,
we didn't do that. And it may well be the case that the reason why we didn't do that is because we didn't maybe think that the rest of the country would be so successful. I mean, that's probably what happened as well, is the whole rest of the country got on top of it and just Victoria fucked it. And so it's elimination was totally available to us, and so now we're sort of retrospectively trying to do
Right.
it.
Have this tunnel vision. It's like, yeah,
But
I know what you mean.
there's not. But when it first happened, I think Australia was bracing to end up like the rest of the world, and so we were talking about flattening the curve. Now, so that all these other consequences of the virus getting out of control don't happen. Now, yeah, trying to tell Victorians that 900 a day, 1,000 a day, 700 a day, aged care, deaths becoming rampant and all this stuff, trying to contextualize that as 3.2% of ICU capacity, and everyone else's life who doesn't have the virus being not in any way worsened, and our tolerance for cases being so much higher than what the peak of the second wave was. Yeah, that's what I've had friends say to me in response to that is, so we're just going to wait till we're New York. We're just going to wait till we're Milan or whatever. Yeah, that's what they say. That's what they'll say back to that.
But I mean, that's a complete lack of imagination of how you actually deal with a pandemic. I mean, the idea that you only have blunt measures and you can't take a surgical approach to reduce the number of hospitalizations and to reduce the number of people who need ICU. Like Alberta, as I mentioned at the start of this conversation, has had for 3 months now daily cases in the hundreds, right? I think the last couple of days we've had 300 cases a day. And yes, there might be a reintroduction of some form of lockdown at some point if healthcare capacity does ever get to that point. But I mean, Alberta has a much lower death rate than Victoria, yet we've had these higher daily case counts. How do you explain that? I think it just shows a lack of imagination from the public, a lack of critical thinking from the public to say, hey, how can we surgically attack this virus? How can we prevent the spread in vulnerable populations within our community and ultimately preserve as much freedom as possible for everyone else who isn't going to rely on the healthcare system? It seems like a pretty rational point, but you're saying a lot of people have refused to engage in that line of thinking?
I don't know, man. I don't know what people's line of thinking is, but I know that the problem is, Rob, that as Australians, you're most inclined to, as Victorians, your closest point of reference is the other states in Australia. So
Granted.
we're relating to that experience. We're not really relating to the rest of the world because we're borrowing a context of we're existing like everywhere else around the world is learning how to live with the virus. Australians and New Zealanders, maybe there's other places in the world that are too, but Australian and New Zealanders are trying to get rid of the virus.
Right.
So you guys are thinking that way and implementing policy that way because it would the cost of trying to get rid of it entirely and the cost of
we're not an island, we're not isolated.
You're not an island. You share a border with the United States. God knows they can't get rid of it. So you're just never going to. So that isn't part of your thinking. So you're forced to then think about, okay, how do we live with this? We're not doing that. We're not doing that. We Victorians need to get rid of this virus because we're not even allowed to, as Victorians, visit any other parts of the country without doing 2 weeks, 2 weeks of entirely self-funded quarantine. Right. So that's that. Yeah. So as soon as you start thinking, with probably the maturity of, how are we going to exist with this virus spreading in the community, that changes. But Victorians aren't thinking like that. Or at least our government isn't. Okay,
so now that sounds at least that you would be willing as someone to restrict all your freedoms and surrender the power to the government to eliminate the virus, and however long it takes, however many businesses need to go bankrupt, however many incidents of domestic violence and all these unattended consequences of lockdowns need to happen, you're not saying that you'd be willing to surrender all this freedom and embrace authoritarianism like everyone else. That's something that you told me. You told me before we got onto air. So, can you just articulate to everyone that your stance on the freedom versus safety trade-off that you think's been taking place in Australia, and maybe your concern with the public's willingness to embrace authoritarianism?
So what I'd say from the outset is that, governments, media, the way the public engages, doesn't engage, chooses to free think, self-educate, whatever. It's, I'd be an outlier in my opinions on things generally, right? And I would say generally, my level of trust in public institutions, my level of trust in the media, whatever, I'd be an outlier there too. Am I a grand conspiracy theorist? I don't know if I'd go as far as saying I'm a grand conspiracy theorist, but I do think, ultimately there should be a really strong level of distrust, and I probably think pretty poorly of people's general level of engagement in ideas, right? So that's from the outset. So that is to say, do I think most governments are, for all intensive purposes, corrupt? Yes. Do I think they serve the best interests of people? No. Do I think there's a really strong level of corporate influence in all levels of government? Absolutely. Do I think there's crazy amounts of evidence for this all the time? Yes. So that's the first thing, right? Where this has terrified me at a level I've never been terrified before, and I guess where I've better clarified the value I have in freedom and democracy is that I think now I understand where the functional value of democracy is, and we sort of feel like we're expressing democracy when we get to vote for governments, because we get to pick. But and I used to study this a lot at uni and stuff. Politicians say they're going to do this, and then they end up doing whatever they want.
Right.
So when you vote for who you get to vote for, it ends up being pretty immaterial, in my opinion, in terms of that as your functional democratic freedom. I think where democracy is more important is the way that it stops a policeman from just walking into your house because he needs to get a warrant or have some just explanation for doing so. I think how it stops the government from coming to stop you from saying something, or how the government is stopped. So basically, the way the government is limited, I think, is more functionally important in your ability to be a free person than these sort of the facade of picking what governments do, right?
Right.
And then you look at COVID and you go, okay, we have all these normal things that governments can't stop us from doing, these really free things, these really important to human nature things like hanging out with each other, sharing each other, playing music together, being able to financially trade, and and basically I'm allowed to participate in transactions because markets are available to me, and exchanging of goods and services is a really important level of freedom. All this stuff that obviously was taken for granted before it all got shut down. Now, on what basis did we give governments powers that they're normally never allowed to have? Right. So that's sort of, you isolate that and you go, on what basis and in what mechanisms did they use to do that? Now, in the case of Australia, or we can isolate it, in the case of Victoria, we've had 800 deaths, right? So we've had less deaths than last year's flu season.
Right. I've actually got the exact figures here, just as a point of reference for everyone. So there is an article that I'd recommend, which was featured in the Sydney Morning Herald and perhaps elsewhere. COVID-19 has hammered home some uncomfortable truths about us as a people by Chris Ullman, who's the 9 News political editor. And the figures exactly are that there were 1,000 fewer deaths in residential aged care in the first 7 months of this year compared to the same time last year. So that just gives context to everyone. So 1,000 fewer deaths at the expense of, complete loss of freedom, economic catastrophe, debt, family breakdown, mental illness, etc., etc.
So this is, so again, and it's why I'll come back to it. But if you're choosing to eliminate a virus, then you need to be really clear about why that's what, and therefore you've got way less margin for error. It necessitates having way more intense lockdowns, restriction of freedoms, all this sort of stuff. So we come back to that. But the government, there's really sound reasons why the government can't do stuff it's been doing at the moment. It's called freedom. It's called democracy, right?
Right.
So, and so
these foundational values that we...
Yeah, foundational values. So, police could probably solve more murders, catch more pedophiles, prosecute more rapists, all these things, but we choose to make it harder for them by forcing them to grant warrants and justify their behavior and constantly having to prove why they should be allowed to do intense things like arrest you and search your house and all this sort of stuff. We constantly make it hard for them. We do it on purpose. We do it on purpose because we think that your rights and freedoms are important.
Right.
You can't...
Potential for misuse, etc.,
all this stuff, right? But in COVID, we've said, no, we want them to be able... We don't care about those things anymore as much as we care about what we're trying to achieve. So
the
what
virus
are we...
is the ultimate overarching objective.
Right, yeah. And in this case, it's been eliminating it. Now, why? Why? And so, unfortunately, you have to actually participate okay, so what are the value of these freedoms? And when am I willing to compromise them? And you might go, okay, well, in the situation of what's happening in New York, it might make sense. In the situation of what's happening in the northern parts of Italy, the worst affected parts of Spain, London, whatever, this might make sense. In Australia, you can say at best, we've done it preemptively to avoid harms being incurred. And then you might ask, okay, well, what level of harms have we preemptively tried to protect ourselves from? So you could build this in different ways. One way, for example, might be, okay, what level of the virus would I be willing to accept? That might be one way. And so you go, well, an amount of the virus that's killed less people than the flu killed last year is clearly an inadequate amount. Right? So you might tolerate 5 times the deaths from the flu last year. You might choose 10 times the deaths of last year because no freedom anywhere in Australia was limited due to the amount of flu that was killing people last year.
Exactly.
So
it's
so
an
we already
absurdity
know
to say we would like negative excess deaths, right?
Yeah. So that's a benchmark you've got. And then you go, well, if the flu was twice as bad as it was last year, would we have maybe put in more restrictions for people visiting aged care facilities? If it was 10 times worse than last year, would we have maybe implemented, X, Y, and Z policies, right? But that creates a benchmark.
Right.
So under that's one way you might do it. Another way you might do it is you might go the effectiveness of policies. So, for example, you might, as a government, put a law in place that says, I don't want people going to each other's houses anymore. And you might go, okay, that's fair enough because that's necessary. What you don't have to accompany me that with is greater level of police powers that they normally don't have to enforce such laws.
Right.
So you might choose to go, okay, this is what we want society to do. We want society to stop doing this and stop doing that. But police are going to have the same level of powers to enact those policies as they do normally.
Right.
So, and again, you might say we don't need to give the police greater powers until where it's being shown that their normal amount of powers isn't enough.
Right.
Right. That could be a way of going about it. But this is not what's. But you would only be caring about these perspectives if you had an inherent value on the limitation of police powers and government powers in the first place.
Right.
And it seems like every time they've been demolished, outside of the Bar Council really freaking out about, and some lawyers and judges freaking out about these proposed arbitrary detention powers.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of this is, why haven't the government entrusted individuals and communities to stop the spread of the virus? So there's this idea that it's a very bureaucratic idea, which is that the only way we can stop this thing, the only way that we can prevent the spread is through top-down action, right? Leaving no space whatsoever for the fact that in the absence of lockdowns, people will lock down themselves. I mean, people often point out Sweden as this example of some, libertarian utopia in terms of its response to COVID. But if you actually look at Sweden, they had an 8% contraction to their GDP because people shut themselves down, right? The idea that businesses wouldn't try to make their environments as safe as possible, the idea that people wouldn't voluntarily wear masks, the idea that people wouldn't voluntarily reduce their connectivity with their community and their friends is absurd. People, I believe that part of freedom and part of living in a democratic, liberal democratic country is an acknowledgement that people have responsibility and people can solve social problems on an individual level without requiring an overwhelming degree of collectivist top-down action. Now, of course, there's a degree of nuance here. Perhaps there are some top-down restrictions which are needed, but by and large, it seems like Victoria's response has acted as if Victorians would be participating in, 50 people orgies and spreading the virus willy-nilly, and a complete a lack of understanding or a lack of trust in individuals to do the right thing.
Yeah, well, yeah. But you've got no tolerance of people doing the wrong thing in a situation where you've got community transmission established and you're trying to eliminate the virus. So the problem is, Rob, there's no tolerance in Victoria for the virus spreading. So yeah, if you were trying to have a society that with a few government measures plus some just decent, thoughtful, social responsibility, you could probably, and a decent healthcare system, you could probably, have the virus spread, probably
Right.
kill, and the people it kills is the people it kills. So you're obviously going to have death from the virus, but you won't have the destruction of society. That's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is get to zero like the rest of the country. Now, the rest of the country is at zero because it basically never left zero.
Right.
So that all those states, all the rest of Australia has gotten to zero without any of this crazy regulation, any of this crazy destruction of their freedoms outside of,
Right.
sort of 4-8 week blocks. The Victorian government probably can't do that. Definitely can't
Right.
do that because there was widespread community transmission. So it's out there. And then, to get it under control, everything needed to be sort of, destroyed. But I guess for me, maybe in 12 months, let's say the Victorian government's successful, and in 3-4 months, we're like Queensland or Western Australia or New South Wales, and, you can have, I can't have anyone, no one's allowed to visit me at my house, zero. And it's been like that for months and months and months. Maybe in 3 months' time, I can have 30 people over
Right.
at my house, and I'll stop caring. But we're going for this policy because the rest of the country is like that, and we need to catch up. And I'm sure that's basically why it's happening. And because politically, if the South Australian Premier starts getting a shitload of cases and he asks, where they've come from, and it's because he's let Victorians come in, and then it's a shit solution
Right.
for him and him, whatever.
Everyone
So
can
the
strong
point-
on Victoria.
Yeah, but the reason we're suffering all this is because governments have the option to decide what level of virus they want to be there.
Right.
That's my problem. So my problem is
Right.
they shouldn't have the right to decide what amount of virus should be in the community outside of
Right.
it being awful. So, for example, if I implement a state of disaster because some earthquake has come in and fucked my city, right? The day that I announce my state of disaster, presumably the earthquake has destroyed a bunch of buildings and there's all this measurable harm.
Right.
It's like state of disaster because X, Y, and Z, roads are fucked, this building's been smashed, this has been destroyed, all this stuff's happened, so I need to implement a state of disaster. This government has implemented a state of disaster based on the experience of other countries and what might happen.
Right. A potential earthquake.
Potential earthquake, right? So a potential earthquake. Not only that, but a potential earthquake
With
that
the
we
accompanying
can-
powers.
with the accompanying powers, and we could decide how bad the earthquake needs to be as a society.
Right.
And we're choosing for it, in this case, to be zero earthquake. In fact,
Yeah.
Better than our normal earthquake season.
Yeah.
Now,
So
to me, that's
there's-
totally unacceptable. So the point is, governments just shouldn't be able
Right.
to get rid of freedoms that we consider crazily important
Right.
all of the rest of the time based on the amount of earthquakes they want to have happen. That shouldn't be their choice. They should be like, they shouldn't be able to get powers till the place is trashed or
Right.
until it's certain the place is going to get trashed. Now you might say, hang on, why wouldn't I want my government to be able to step in before awful things happen?
Right.
Because governments ought not to be trusted.
That's right.
And that
case
needs to
in
be
point-
built into the system. And
That's
that-
right. And case in point is the fact that they butchered hotel quarantine. If they were such a perfectly omniscient, wise body, which no government official could ever possibly be, but if they had an amazing track record, potentially there's an argument in favor of it. But there's just a history of corruption, a history of mistakes.
Dude, the corruption. All right, proving federal government corruption is less common. State government corruption in Australia, the amount of different state governments you can pull up and go, there were potentially shady things, all the way to Eddie Obeid is currently in jail.
Right.
and that Labor government in New South Wales was like so transparently corrupt for such a long period of time.
Right.
It's like unbelievable, right? The previous state government in Australia, the Liberal state government in Australia, you have the planning minister, Matthew fucking greasy guy,
Matthew Guy.
hanging out with ordering lobsters with mobsters and all the
Lobster
rest
with
of
the
it.
mobster, that's right.
We know we know governments are vulnerable to corruption, and they corrupt all the
Right.
time, and they caught all the time. Even like right now, IBAC, I think yesterday or today, has released all of these, is going to prosecute the guy that was sleeping with the premier for all these different forms of corruption.
Right.
Letting people pay for their visas and all, getting paid for approvals and all this stuff. We know governments are corrupt. We know they abuse powers. We also know that they're driven by self-interest and for political purposes. And in
Right.
my opinion, COVID has become a political football. The amount of cases your state has, the way that you restrict borders, being hard lines on a border. Governments care about being elected. Generally, I think the two main drivers of government are being elected, so winning elections, and the reason you want to win elections is so you can grant favors to important people,
Right.
so that you spend the rest of your life sort of getting benefits off them. Now,
And then
that's
in
a very
turn,
negative
those important people can help you get reelected. It's a
they
cycle.
help you get re-elected, but ultimately you don't want to be in government for any longer than you need to be to grant enough favors to leave government, work, and then get really nice cushy jobs afterwards for all the people you granted favors for, right? So
Right.
the natural progression is you work in government for a bit, you grant important people enough favors that you get to leave, and then after you leave, you get to make a lot of cash sitting on the board of an important company. Now that's a very negative perspective on government. That's what I think government effectively does. The point is, you've got to have a system that says government can't be trusted. That's why you have all these limitations.
Right.
When you're deciding that emergency measures should get rid of such limitations, those emergency measures need to be really fucking big, really important, really bad.
Right.
And what I feel has happened in Australia is we've inherited the pandemic from overseas from a fear perspective, but not
Right.
from a actual disaster perspective, and that context has allowed our government to do everything it does.
Yeah, we're acting as if we're Northern Italy when in reality we got nowhere close to Northern Italy.
Where we, having 100 cases a day and a health system that's totally fine would be the envy of anywhere in the world, just like it is for you right now in Canada, and where we've instead, participating in some numbers obsessed game, some fucking rat race to zero,
Right.
and yeah, we've chosen we've allowed freedom limitations to be acceptable under that context, and to me, it's just crazy.
Exactly.
And I think generally a big driver of that is that people don't. I think people have a nostalgic value on freedom. And I also think people just trust governments way too much.
Right. I also think people don't really appreciate the value of freedom because Australia just generally grants a lot of freedom. And, I think, who did I hear say this? I forgot who it was, but I was listening to a podcast and they say in countries which have freedom, you're more likely to see protests arguing for the government to take away their freedom. And in countries that don't have freedom or live under authoritarianism, they're more likely to have protests asking for their freedom off governments. And so Australia is so far high up, generally speaking, on the freedom spectrum that I think people don't realize what it would be like if they didn't have that freedom permanently. And it's why they don't fight for it. And I think it's another beautiful thing of the US Constitution. And Australia doesn't really have a powerful constitution in the same way that America does, but the constitution in the US is there to remind people of why freedom is such a foundational value, and it provides a robust check on government powers to say, in some cases there's nothing you can do to limit someone's speech in the US. There isn't. Free speech is pretty much an absolute right in US. It doesn't care if you're spouting racism. It doesn't care if you're spouting a conspiracy. It's such a foundational right that it's embedded in the Constitution, and there's nothing you can do to take that away. It feels like that's something that Australia doesn't really have. I know you and I have actually spoken about this in the past, but Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights almost as a reminder why we care about these freedoms, and that's why it's so easy for someone like Dan Andrews to take them away.
Yeah, I think it's a massive contributor. Yeah, like we don't have explicit rights and freedoms in our constitution. We do have a human rights charter in Victoria, funnily enough, which actually did restrict a few things the chief health officer could make people do. One of them was being able to exercise. So that was, if they could have, they would have kept us indoors.
Wow, there you go.
24/7.
That's a small win for the Human Rights Charter.
But the Human Rights Charter basically said if people can't exercise, so they couldn't even stop people who actually had the virus from leaving their rooms, if they lived in an apartment or something, they had to have the right to go outside and exercise.
That's
because
interesting.
It meant that it was a form of imprisonment, and you basically can't imprison anyone who isn't imprisoned. Mm-hmm. So you had to have the right to exercise. It was interesting, but yeah, I mean that's just thank God we got protected to go outside for 1 hour walks. Yeah, I just think it's just Victorians need to decide whether they're comfortable with this statement that we've experienced the least amount of virus compared to anywhere of the world, probably except for like New Zealand or whatever, and we've experienced the world's give or take the world's worst lockdown.
That's right.
So you can, and then you've got to ask yourself as a Victorian, why have we done this? Now, I think the main reason is politics amongst the states of Victoria, right? So
amongst the states of Australia, right?
Amongst the states of Australia, yes. And everyone's trying to, wanting to be the zero state. They were all able to achieve it. We weren't. They started closing borders. And basically, the majority of the states, because they were able to achieve elimination, basically meant Australia had to go down an elimination path. So we should make no mistake about why we've done this. We have not done this to not become Italy. We have not done this to protect the health system. We have not done this to protect older Australians and vulnerable Australians. We've done this because of politics, right? So that's why we've done this. Now, are politicians honest about the reasons they do things, the reasons why they bring tax cuts, the reasons why a particular company's won a bid for a $5 billion infrastructure project? No. Governments always lie to us. They're always shit. But the government, that's okay the rest of the time, because when the government decides to do things, change taxes, build bridges, award contracts for infrastructure projects, when the government does that,
it needs to go through due process. It needs to go through,
but that's the stuff that we allow government to do all the time, regularly, that we're not that worried about. We should be, and we sort of want to elect governments who do a better job of that than a shit job of that, but that's okay. Politics can be the reason for taxes going up or down. Politics shouldn't be a reason for why you have or shouldn't have rights.
Right.
And that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that in this, this is probably the clearest way I've explained it, that the reasons for why we've gone down the path we've gone down as a country has nothing to do with ultimately protecting us from the virus in a way that would be acceptable. It's got to do with reasons that aren't that. And so governments should be limited in their ability to do what they've done so that they can't just decide when it's acceptable. And I can't believe that. Yeah, I can't believe that we don't have. I can't believe we don't have constitutional mechanisms that stop them from doing this. But
I think that's a really important point. One other angle of potentially looking at this is, yes, I agree with your analysis, but this is something I've noticed living abroad, living both in the Netherlands and in Canada. Australia generally has a safety fetish not seen on a level in most democratic countries. So, it's strange to me. It's ironic that progressives in Australia would generally be supportive of these safety COVID measures to prevent deaths, but then they wonder why they don't get interesting reform on things like marijuana legislation. It's no surprise that Canada has legalized marijuana before any state in Australia. It's no surprise that we have now 10, potentially 20 states in America who have done the same. It's no surprise that in Australia you can't access, a Juul or a vape to potentially help you not smoke cigarettes. It's no surprise why cigarettes cost about $100 in Australia. It's no surprise why you have to wear helmets everywhere. There's a level of safety that Australians have almost internalized, that safety trumps freedom at pretty much every corner. And then if you're willing to grant the government powers to do that in the preceding decades, then don't complain when the government prioritizes safety over your freedom in the case of a pandemic. So that's something that, I've definitely noticed living abroad, is that, Australia is a strange place for how strongly we prioritize safety. It's why we have speed cameras on pretty much every third intersection. These are strange things to someone in Canada, to someone in the Netherlands, to someone in Western Europe, to someone in America. And I don't think a lot of Australians have fully understood that. Is that something that you've noticed?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think you're right, and I think it is a contributor. You could nanny state, whatever you want to call it. We're super regulated here. We got, it's like, increases the costs of a lot of things. Like how strict we are with occupational health and safety and stuff. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's, yeah, I mean, look, being forced to wear a helmet, being forced to wear a seatbelt, whatever, there's a pretty transparent transaction there. I'm losing the freedom to not have to wear a helmet, but, we're gaining, what are we gaining? We're gaining, probably less fatal bicycle accidents, whatever it is that we're gaining in that situation. Can you draw a connection between, not wearing a helmet being forced to wear a helmet and then not being allowed to have any friends at your house, have any gatherings, have police walk into your property whenever they want, arbitrary detention, all this sort of stuff. I reckon there's probably a little bit of a relationship there, but you would have thought that people understand the pretty massive difference between having to wear a helmet and not being able to see your friends and have real relationships anymore and have any kind of freedom whatsoever. So I don't know. I think, is there an overall, put it this way, if I could get rid of, if it is the helmets wearing and the compulsory seatbelts and the stupid drug legislation, and it is that attitude that makes Victorians just more susceptible to the level of government invasion that we've experienced during this pandemic, then yeah, I'd be happy to fuck all that stuff off. Absolutely. Right. But I don't, you know, to be honest, man, I need to live elsewhere. Understand other communities better. I mean, I understand that
Right.
you know, places like America and Canada
Right.
better appreciate freedoms than we do in Australia, but I don't know. We seem pretty keen to regulate here. I would agree with that.
Right. Another good point on this, Jules, is something that you mentioned off there is an inability for the public to see the opportunity cost of these measures and how more lives could have been saved if we didn't go down this really costly lockdown. Do you mind elaborating on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, I'm sure there's lots of resources out there, but, you know, I've got two perspectives on this. So one, I've got an immunity deficiency. So my body doesn't produce any IgA, immunoglobulin A. I don't know what the data is on how much worse people experience COVID with this, but, you know, I'm sure it's worse. So there's that. The second is, you know, I lost my grandmother this year, and my, you know, and what she died of is kind of unclear, but it was some sort of cold thing.
Right. You've got some
her
skin in
lungs-
the game here.
You've got some skin in the game, but she didn't die of COVID, but she died of some sort of cold, you know. So why am I bringing this up? Okay, so, you know, ethically, right, we're choosing to do things to protect a part of the community that's going to die from the virus, right? I mean, and we know that percentage, particularly with better treatment now, and when you don't have a healthcare that's overwhelmed, so that is to say that everyone experiencing the virus gets treatment. So you make sure that the amount of the virus that's in the community isn't so great that you can't treat everyone. So that was clearly increasing the death rate. If I can't give people ventilators when they're at the most acute period of experiencing the illness, their chances of dying is way higher. So not taken into account. So assuming that everyone gets the best possible treatment.
Right.
The people who die from the virus are overwhelmingly people who are unwell. Right? So unwell as a consequence of being real old and therefore having a shitload of comorbidity. So the amount of illness you have in your life is way higher when you're older, and you're less healthy when you're older generally, right? We just know that to be true. And then, you know, if you've got diabetes, if you've got cancer, if you've got potentially autoimmune disease or like I have, a genetic immunity impairment, you're just less healthy, right? I mean, we can grab my health records and I can clearly show everyone my exposure to illness over my soon to be 27 years of life has been way higher than everyone.
The audience won't know this, but Jules pretty much didn't attend a single day of school in year 11 because his health record wasn't that crashed out. So there's some serious health issues there, right? Cool. So the point is, I think it's fair to say that people who are dying from COVID are definitely not going to be have less years of life expectancy available to them than people who aren't dying. An ordinary
right?
healthy person, sure.
Yeah, now that's true of anyone who just dies in their old age. But it's interesting. Like my grandmother, you know, only reason she was alive was because of the 20 medications she was taking every morning.
Right.
If she wasn't taking all those medications, she'd definitely be dead, right? And in fact, she'd had previous hospital visits that meant, you know, if we didn't have miraculous medical interventions, she'd be dead. Like a shitload of people who are alive in their 80s and 90s, even their 70s. If it isn't for awesome modern medicine, they'd be dead. Does that make their lives less valuable? Depends how you want to context that question. Does it mean that someone who's healthy, who's otherwise healthy, but is 18 years old and has lost their kidney due to a car accident, should they get their kidney over my grandmother who's, 89 and only being kept alive by a shitload of medications and might die for a whole range of reasons in the next 5 years? Yes. So she should not get that kidney or that liver or that heart. Right. An otherwise healthy 18-year-old definitely should. What does our current medical system say? It explicitly gives it to the 18-year-old, right? We've already had this discussion in medicine. We already know how we make that decision. So, you can choose to. There's two ways of doing it. You could choose to have a philosophical discussion around, whose lives are worth more based on medical interventions, or you could just choose what we've been doing for the last 30 years, which is that we already make that decision every day as doctors, and we choose to give that kidney, that organ, that blood, whatever that intervention is to the younger, more healthy person. So we already do that. And it doesn't seem like we were turning the world upside down last year about preferencing healthier people over unhealthier people, right? So COVID is potentially killing a shitload of people that are otherwise going to die pretty soon. They're fragile. They're not healthy. Now, it's not always doing that, right? And we've seen evidence of that. But the great amount of data is that, even when it's 40, 30-year-olds, people who aren't in their 80s and 90s, it's 30, 40-year-olds that are overrepresented as being obese. Yeah. Type 2 diabetes is probably the major one, right?
I think it's likely to be similar in Victoria, but here in Alberta, I believe it still stands that the average death of an Albertan due to COVID is actually higher than the average life expectancy period.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the data is there. Now you're starting to descend into an uncomfortable ethical discussion about who lives and dies, what the value of a life is, or whatever. But I just put it this way. My grandmother died of whatever she died of. In the end, her lungs ended up full of fluid, and her heart stopped. God bless her. If she died of the flu, if she died of gastro, if she died of whatever virus, and if she died of COVID, I can't be certain, but I'd be, my grandparents were directly opposed to lockdown, and just were like, people, when viruses come, people have to die. That was their approach. But the point
Same
is,
as my grandparents.
Whatever she died of, man, she died of being old, and she died of being old as and unhealthy. Yeah. Whatever that final thing is that pushes your really frail old grandparent off the edge. If they're in a nursing home, the point is they can no longer care for themselves at home. So you can't be in a nursing home unless you need care, and so you're not well. You're at the end of your life, and the thing that gets you in the end. You don't say, oh, yeah, no, my 92-year-old, uncle died of old age. And as human beings, when we lose the ability, and this is my opinion, but when we lose the ability to fight the illnesses that show up every year, the diseases and the viruses that show up every year, generally that's the flu, and we no longer have the ability to fight that, whether that's because our body's been so decimated by chemotherapy or by immune suppressant drugs, because our autoimmune thing is so out of control, or because we're just so old, or our heart's so weak because of our diabetes, whatever it is. We don't go, oh, he died of the flu. We've got the maturity and the perspective to understand that death is attributable to just a person no longer being able to function as a human, because functioning as a human means you can handle the diseases that show up every year, right?
Right. But our COVID discussion has been unable to have an awareness of that.
No, every COVID death's like some major tragedy. It's a huge stat. It's an absolute disaster. It's a death that definitely wouldn't have happened otherwise. It's a death because of COVID, right? And it's just bullshit. It's just not true. And what is, the difference with COVID is, okay, so the amount of people that die from COVID, if those people are gonna die from some other reason due to their frailty of health in the next 4 to 5 years, and that's a crazy majority, a crazy proportion of the amount of deaths that result from COVID, then that needs to be taken into consideration.
Right.
It can't not be. That is just bullshit. It's
Yeah.
just totally unfair
The
on
Peter Singer
all of the
assessment
people. All of the people you've chosen to kill by protecting those people. And that's why it's important. It's
Right.
not like we've chosen to protect the lives of all these people vulnerable for COVID without killing a bunch of other people. You know, we've killed a shitload of people as a consequence of taking care of protecting the vulnerable against COVID.
So
We've killed them
there's the-
because of
yeah.
mental health. We've
Mental
killed them
health.
because of poverty.
Yep.
We've killed them because they've all deferred all this medical treatment and medical examination. That means when they find their cancer eventually, it's going to be
Right.
the incurable kind, not
That's
the curable kind.
I'm pretty sure in the UK they're predicting an extra 60,000 deaths from cancer over the next 10 years because of the way COVID has distorted the general operation of the healthcare system.
If you catch bowel cancer as a 50-year-old at its early stage, your chances of bowel cancer is the most fatal cancer in Australia. It's also the most treatable because it's captured early, right? So,
Right.
you know, someone
Early
who
ID.
catches their bowel cancer early lives for another 40 years, right? Lives for another 50 years, right?
Right.
Someone who's going to die of COVID is likely to only be alive
Yeah.
for another couple of years.
So that's the Peter Singer assessment of, you know, the framework of using years lost versus years of life lost. And that's essentially what you're arguing for us to consider.
That's one component. That's
Yep.
component A. B, is dying the only measurable harm? So, you know, this is, you know, I'm pretty much, you know, Singer's very transparent. He's very, you know, the reason why probably, you know, Singer's, you know, we're just using a bit of logic here, right? You don't have to agree with this, but I'm pretty much quoting Singer bang on, but it's still important. You know, any utilitarian assessment of this. The second way of looking at it is, okay, so now we're measuring the harm of deaths. What about the harm of what about the emotional, psychological, and economic harms? All these harms matter also, right? So, for example,
Uptick in suicide, uptick in depression, uptick in anxiety.
up to poverty, up to the fact that
yeah, they believe that just this year already, this isn't a forecast, but we've added, as a globe, 37 million people to poverty.
yeah, and a lot of them are going to starve and miss out on their educations.
Right.
You know, children won't be able to go to school and
Doubling of child malnutrition across the world, a doubling of extreme poverty by the end of next year. So that really frames it for everyone.
Yeah. So like the point is the costs of this are enormous, and it's not fair to pretend like every life that can be saved from lockdowns or that every COVID death needs to be considered a tragedy.
Well, I mean, this also highlights the hypocrisy of Daniel Andrews, who says, I'm not in the position of picking who dies. Well, he can't avoid it. The lockdown does discriminate against who dies. He's saying that he'd rather save someone who's 90 years old and frail and catches COVID. He's concerned about preventing that person from dying, but he's choosing for, potentially, a middle-aged Victorian man who loses his business, develops alcoholism, and then kills himself. He is choosing who dies and who's saved. So that's, complete nonsense coming from Daniel Andrews, and no one really calls that out.
Yeah, no, that's right. So and also they choose all the time. Like certain, like if a new awesome cancer drug comes out, that isn't just automatically given access to every Australian.
Right.
It's like, they have to pay for it themselves. If we don't.
We could.
There are so many different health issues. I mean, this is what that specialist said to me. He's like, if you just call COVID a health issue, imagine if we approached other health issues like this. It would be crazy. Now, COVID, when the health system is crashing,
Right.
is not just the health issue. It's that's a massive societal issue, right?
Yeah,
Like,
sure.
like hospitals becoming overflown and hospitals no longer being able to implement good.
My
good
catching of COVID directly affects you as someone who's unrelated to me because now you don't get access to healthcare, etc.
Yeah, and people who work in hospitals no longer have the ability to implement infection control, and working in a hospital becomes way more dangerous than it normally should be.
Granted.
That's an important issue. So yeah, I mean, working in a hospital necessitates you have an increased exposure to viruses and diseases, particularly if you work in infectious diseases or whatever. So that's normally there, but they train and they wear gloves and all this stuff. But yeah, people catch gastro and viruses in hospitals more often than otherwise. But there's an acceptable level of that can be acceptably mitigated. Clearly, when the hospitals are just fucked on with COVID, that exposure to healthcare workers is just unfair, right?
Yeah.
So that's an ethical consideration. Again, that's not that when that becomes an issue is a lot higher than fucking 10 cases a day, 20 cases a day, 50 cases a day.
Absolutely.
Or,
another example of this opportunity cost, Jules, is the Victorian economy, I believe, is going to contract. Some people are saying $320 billion or something to that effect due to the lockdown alone. Now, if the Victorian economy were $320 billion richer, presumably we could afford to invest in more hospitals, more hospital beds, better doctors, better nurses, and that can also reduce the number of deaths, not this year, but in the years to come. Does that get spoken about?
Yeah, or the fact that every time a government chooses to spend money on something, it's money that could be spent elsewhere.
That's right.
So, like last year we chose to, I don't know, what did we choose to do last year? Every dollar we spent last year could have been used instead on domestic violence, on
mental illness,
on this new level of treatment, on this level of mental illness, this level of this. Like we're constantly, last year we could have chosen to hand out less grants to AFL clubs to build their nice professional facilities, and instead use that money to house
homeless people,
to house victims of domestic violence, and probably could have saved people. We didn't do that last year. Last year we could have, we could have increased the scope of subsidizing mental health visits to psychologists, which we've done this year. We could have done that last year. We chose not to. Instead, we handed out tax breaks to, we're always deciding who gets to live and die by government policy. Right. Always. And when you spend a $300 billion on one particular health issue, that's $300 billion that, could have just been given to aid to poor countries if we wanted, and kept a shitload of fucking 10-year-olds alive and given them an education and built them schools and hospitals. So it's like the problem when you go down this rabbit hole is, the reason why Peter Singer ends up with controversial propositions is because he follows through the ethical consequences of decisions to their fullest level.
Right.
And so you start looking at every dollar you earn as an individual as, I could buy a nice brand new pair of shoes, or I could donate that money to some sort of charity that helps keep a young person involved. So if I'm honest about money, if I'm honest about the hours I spend in my life, and I take the ethical cost of my decisions to their maximum, basically everything I do that isn't taking care of my most important needs is an opportunity to help someone that I'm not taking, right? So now that's a very extreme level, but that is reality.
Yeah.
So
no, of course,
governments do that all the time, and we've chosen to keep unhealthy people alive at the expense of a whole lot of other people, and that's important to understand.
Yeah, absolutely, Jules. So I think the last topic I really want to discuss here is, so we've outlined why all of this has been an enormous encroachment in civil liberties, why that never should have happened in the first place. But I think one component of why it's been allowed to happen is just the general state of journalism. So something I've noticed living outside of Australia, of course, is that there seems to be the public attacking journalists, the few journalists who do ask tough questions of Dan. There's a common line, don't play politics in a pandemic, or he's doing the best he can, or he had 100 press conferences in 100 days. He's doing the best he can. And there was one journalist, I got her name up here, what's her surname? Her surname is Baxendale. I don't have it. Rachel Baxendale. That's it. Sorry about that. Rachel Baxendale, she asked a question of Daniel Andrews and saying, hey, is it really fair? Is it really fair if we expect someone in the countryside to be forced to wear a mask when they're going for a walk and there isn't someone in a 1 kilometer square radius of them? And I believe Dan Andrews just criticized her as indulging some type of esoteric discussion. And then in the following days, all over Twitter, there were memes mocking Rachel Baxendale for asking an esoteric question when it's a very valid question to ask about some of these restrictions. So it seems to me from the outside that there's a risk premium placed on journalists asking tough questions of those in power that falls outside of the traditional scope of discussion that the mainstream media institution will allow. Is that something that you've been noticing as well?
Yeah, but I sort of said this before. I feel like I'm an outlier in, my opinions on things, journalism fails to hold politicians to account.
Yeah.
And generally, and even if what you're saying is true, and that journalists are sort of coerced, by in this case ridicule and sort of ostracized by their own community for wanting to participate in something contrary to the current narrative. Mm-hmm. You ask politicians questions, they just give you, even if they were asking really good questions, and the ones who do ask really good questions, mm-hmm. they don't get satisfactory answers.
Right.
So, and there's a limit to how, if journalists sort of have a responsibility inbuilt in their profession to eventually accept the terms of governments. It's like, I remember, this is, if someone isn't Australian, they're definitely not going to remember this, but Tony Abbott was opposition leader for 8 years. He became prime minister. Him and Joe Hockey implemented their first budget, which is the, probably 90% of a government's quantifiable policy agenda. And I would say the greatest majority of this budget was stuff that no one had ever seen before, and was entirely in opposition to a whole lot of explicit promises made in the election, right? So it was the equivalent of buying a product and then having that product be not at all what it was advertised, right?
Right.
So the beginning of and then when a budget's passed in Australia, the sort of convention is for the Treasurer to go on the 7:30 report on ABC, our national government-funded broadcaster, and get interviewed by the leading Australian political journalist.
Right.
So the interview begins, Rob, and you'd be proud of the journalist. I think it was Sarah Ferguson, God bless her, and she begins the interview by saying to Joe Hockey, how does it feel to just treat the population with utter contempt and do whatever you want as a politician? So it begins by asking a hard question, right?
Right.
So it's like, how is it acceptable that you just do whatever you want, even though you were in opposition for 8 years advertising something, and now you've done a whole bunch of policies that no one had ever heard of before. This flies in the face of democracy, right? Now, does Joe Hockey engage with that question seriously? No, they to and fro for about 2 or 3 minutes, and then the details of what the government's announced are discussed.
Right.
That's journalism. Journalism doesn't have the opportunity to just all of a sudden go, hang on, this is totally unfair. Hang on, this is not what should be happening. Hang on, and just hold them account to that. You can make a little bit of a stand as a journalism, call out something, but ultimately you've got to participate in the narrative of reality. And reality is what were we going to do? You know, like all of a sudden take massive protests and turn over a government. Like, I feel like, you know, I guess the thing I want to communicate is relying on journalism to hold politicians to account enough so that they do the right thing is silly and stupid. And it's not going to happen. It's going to happen to an extent, but it's not going to happen. Relying on voting for governments to do the right thing and voting them out when they do the wrong thing, and voting in governments who actually care about us, that as an accountability measure is going to work to an extent, but it's not really going to achieve that. What you need in place is rules that stop governments from doing things at all, like
some constitution.
Like constitutions. You actually need real limits, and relying on journalism any further than what's realistic is just like, this has been... Does the media ultimately support the narratives of governments that do fucked things? Yes, and I think it's always going to, particularly mainstream media. We can't be relying on journalists to stop police from coming into my house whenever they want. Like that should be built in somewhere else.
Yeah,
and
I take your point.
You know, that's my point.
Yeah, no, that's
I don't know if that was a really bad answer, but I think that
that's fair enough. I mean, the point I was getting at is that there seems to be just an absence of journalists who are willing to ask these tough questions. It seems like when they do ask a controversial question of the Premier, they seem to be the only one of a group of 20 journalists in the press club who are willing to ask that question. A lot of the journalists seem are playing more of a role that's analogous to a conduit for their press release, as opposed to asking critical questions and holding them accountable. I mean, the one exception to this now is obviously hotel quarantine. They're going pretty deep into that, but let's say the hotel quarantine didn't happen. I don't think, Jules, there still would be these questions about has the public bargained for this security versus freedom trade-off? I think the answer is no. What do we think of negative excess deaths? I don't think anyone's asked that question. I think journalists are by and large unwilling to take on these risks. And what's even more corrosive than that is that when one journalist actually does stick their head out, they're vilified not only by the public but by fellow journalists. Their opposition to lockdowns, for example, is conflated with support for conspiracy theories. COVID doesn't exist, COVID is a hoax, or 5G conspiracies, or anti-vax conspiracies. I mean, there was a Guardian article today that it was talking about the 5 kilometer rule, how it's extremely unpopular, and for some reason, it said in the article that the quote of, you know, the 5 kilometer rule is a curtailment of people's freedom, has been associated with 5G conspiracy groups on Facebook, as if, what does that have to do with anything about 5G conspiracies on Facebook? So I think the whole media mechanism is really bizarre. I think part of it has to do with people afraid that they'll be called out. They aren't willing to take a risk, and I think because of that, that's why we've seen the gradual removal of all these freedoms, and it's gone virtually unchecked in the media class.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think, whether that's some like deliberate masterminded thing or not, I mean, I don't know. But it comes back to, you know, Rob, for people to actually care about any degree of their freedom being limited, their economic situation being worsened or whatever, you would actually need to take time to challenge the prescribed narrative, which is, why we're doing this, what we're trying to achieve, why it's important. And, these ethical discussions, these conversations, these, even just talking about, what is the value of my freedom? What is the value of me being able to see my friends and have them over at my house and, do things on my own private property, whatever. All this stuff is, it's not really the domain of sort of mainstream conversations. And, what I was saying before off our chat is what you're much more likely to write about is, what life's like during COVID and how people are dating during COVID and, these new exercise trends during COVID and, how workplaces are going to change forever because of COVID and, all this other stuff, and there was, articles written by important people, letters written by vice chancellors of universities and Peter Singer and all this different stuff, putting forward perspectives. I've heard opposing perspectives. I've seen it written in the media. I don't think it's been totally filtered out, but I think ultimately, that's if the government was doing something that was transparently illegal, I'm sure journalism would be going apeshit and constantly pointing out how illegal our government's behaving. It hasn't been doing stuff that's explicitly illegal, and if it has been doing something illegal, it has to be proven to be illegal by taking them to court. So, yeah, I don't know. I feel like in this case, I feel like journalism has been pretty well aligned to the values and expectations of regular Victorians. And I think the reason why you see 5G conspiracies being related to people, I don't have any 5G things. I think the virus is real. And I don't think we should just let the virus spread. I don't not care about oldies. I don't think I have extreme opinions on this, but I do really, really, really care about the fact that I still don't understand why a policeman should just be allowed to walk into my house. Like I don't understand why that needs to be a part of everything else that's going on. But there's that. But unfortunately, a lot of the time, people who are actively posting non-mainstream views on social media or whatever, they tend to be extremists, don't they? Because I think most people, like I said, who even if they do have a care about this, and even if they do find this to be a little bit inappropriate, does focusing on it and posting about it make you feel better? Or should you just be, focusing on your own mental health, making sure that you're exercising, you're going for walks? Like I feel like most free-thinking people would rather focus on their own individual challenges, and there's a fucking shitload of individual challenges that show up during COVID, than choose to care that much about stuff they can't control. And I think that's the main reason, and journalism still serves that purpose, Rob. Journalism isn't sitting there going, how can I best inform a free-thinking population that really cares about considering, the right and wrong actions of governments and really wants to know all about that. I actually think most people, including the well-educated, would rather focus on how they can positively experience the great challenge of this rather than what governments should or shouldn't be doing. Because I don't think, A, they feel like they have that much control. B, I don't think they feel like participating in big ethical, philosophical questions. C, care about learning about constitutional rights and freedoms and legal rights and freedoms. I don't think they give a shit about any of this. No. I think what they most care about is how can they keep their family sane? How can they keep themselves sane? How can they financially survive this? How can they psychologically survive this? How can they entertain themselves and stay healthy? And I think that, and journalism exists to serve that function, mainly as well. What people actually want to read about, what they care about. So, yeah, I think, and for those reasons, I just wish we had rules that stop this from happening, you know? So
that's fair enough, Jules. I mean, I just want to touch on one more point related to journalism. So, I mean, it's not completely fair to say no one in the press has criticized Dan Andrews' measures for violating people's freedoms. It's often come from journalists from Murdoch Press who have written pretty aggressively and argued aggressively on TV that this is a huge containment of freedoms. The economic cost isn't worth it. The cost of mental health isn't worth it. All these things. And then something that I actually noticed as a piece of media criticism is people are unwilling to engage with arguments coming from a particular institution, whether it's Murdoch or Fairfax, simply because of the institution that they're affiliated with. So this Murdoch press equals evil trap that I think people can fall victim to. It's like if a journalist happens to be paid by Rupert Murdoch, but they're writing an extremely logical argument about how the containment of freedoms doesn't justify the benefits that we're getting in terms of increased safety, why isn't that a valid argument? But instead, we just devolve into this, Rupert Murdoch equals evil, and he's trying to ruin Australian democracy. And I think the same applies going the other way. How dare this person, who writes for The Guardian? The Guardian's a shambolic left-wing communist institution, and I think it does cut both ways. But what do you think that says about the state of public discourse? Maybe you don't care as much about journalism as I do, and this is why you want constitutional powers to just to sidetrack this whole shit show. But does it not frustrate you when you see that constantly, those ad hominem attacks of people simply because of the newspaper or the journalistic institution that they're associated with?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's if you're going to, like, there's a balance. You shouldn't dismiss something just because it's from a particular outlet. Because there's not really a need to, there's not a need to dismiss an argument because you've got the ability to think for yourself. Mm-hmm. So you can, but if someone's reputation is appalling, can you be justified in being suspicious of a particular perspective? Totally. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a mixture. Is there enough quantifiable evidence to say, Murdoch media outlets push biases and agendas that are wrong? Sure. Is it frustrating that Murdoch press has probably overrepresented discussions around freedom during COVID? Yeah, it is, because it means that a lot of progressive people are not going to listen to it because progressive people will dismiss. Not going to touch it. But it's. Yeah, what you're talking about there is a huge. I mean, you could read about, study the complexities around the way people engage with media forever. Mm-hmm. I think the fact that people dismiss material based on where it comes from is, I think, partially valid. The fact that it happens too much of the time is a consequence of how free-thinking people are in general. But
right,
I put forward people aren't very free-thinking.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me offer one final twist and see what I get out of you. So let's assume that the pandemic disproportionately affected white-collar workers. That is, white-collar workers could no longer work from home, or people weren't receiving from the government in terms of unemployment benefits, an amount that's equivalent to what they would receive if they were working. So they were essentially getting the same wage for not doing the work. So if that had flipped, so white collar workers are now out of a job, and if Daniel Andrews belonged to the centre right party, the Liberal Party, as opposed to Labor, do you think Victoria would be in the same state that it is now?
No, but that's. So hang on, Rob. Are you saying if everyone wasn't? So you're saying if welfare was inadequate for white collar workers?
Welfare, and in other words, I think blue collar workers generally wouldn't support the lockdown because it's more likely to affect their livelihoods compared to white collar workers. And I think white collar workers disproportionately get to affect the media and what gets written, and the public opinion, the opinion of the intelligentsia, and I think that has a meaningful effect on the measures that Dan Andrews has been allowed to put forth.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think people's $1,500 a fortnight or $1,200 a fortnight, depending on your employment situation, has definitely been the critical factor in allowing everyone to pass away their freedoms. Because the freedom you have the freedom of employers to initiate transactions, so the freedom to trade creates the environment for the freedom to be employed, and the freedom to be employed is what creates the opportunity to feed yourself and buy shit. That's been destroyed, and the cost of that's been deferred by the government choosing to go into enormous amounts of debt and pay everyone a huge subsidy. So that's that part of it has definitely meant that all of this COVID stuff has been able to happen, because even though it's decimating workforces and populations, it's being subsidized for, which is important. That would make it, that would result in huge riots in the street and all the rest of it. It would just, the whole fabric of society would collapse if people couldn't feed themselves. The group that isn't being well advocated for or being spoken about or cared about are the small businesses that are just being destroyed.
Right. Right.
And that group of society, if they want to talk about themselves, then progressive, people who are being taken care of, if the value of your employment's pretty close to the new government subsidy,
that's right,
you're in a pretty privileged position to all of a sudden make a value judgment and go, oh, this business owner just cares about their money instead of.
There's an incentive to support the lockdown for sure.
Yeah, but I think, look, if it was a Liberal government doing this to everyone, would the situation be different? If a right-wing government was in Victoria right now, would this look different? I would say, I don't know, my gut feeling is that the political need for the Victorian government, regardless of who was leader, to go down this crazy elimination route would be there for whoever was in charge.
Right.
Is my gut feeling.
All right, Jules. Well, on that note, I really appreciate your time. I think it's been over close to 2 hours now, so we really dive deep on that one.
Hopefully it's of use. And all I'd say is, and this is the really important thing that I'd say, out of everything I've said today, it's really complicated. And you can grab the ethical dilemma around COVID. You can grab the quantifiable discussion around COVID. So you can say, for example, you could go, okay, does lockdown actually result in better outcomes overall? And then you could, and so that's like a scientific / economic assessment. That involves modeling stuff that's way beyond my fucking scope. What actually happens during lockdown? What do we understand about it? What happens when we don't do it? What that's a whole separate discussion. Then if you're actually able to get objective objective data on that was accurate, then you could say, okay, ethically, which do we prefer? And what mix is the correct mix? Then a whole separate question becomes around what are the values of freedom? What should they be? What are governments doing? What's acceptable for a government intervention in your life? When can we trust governments to do things? When can't we? What are the politics of all this? Like, why has the Victorian government decided to be so strict about it? How have we been coerced into elimination due to the unique opportunity that Australia had with the virus? Like, there are so many parts of this that you could talk about for hours and research, and that, people, whole careers could be founded upon some of these inquiries. What I would say as a Victorian, for Victorians to deal with, and I said it before, but this is the last thing to be said, regardless about how complicated all this and how much time you can spend discussing it, either way, all I know is I'm a Victorian. I've experienced one of the worst lockdowns in the world, and my jurisdiction has experienced one of the lowest amounts of this virus anywhere in the world. And those two accompanying facts piss me off beyond belief and make me kind of ashamed to be part of the population group that I'm now a part of. And that if that doesn't trigger you to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole into some of these inquiries, whether it's how media's done this to us or how Daniel Andrews has done this, whatever it is, if it doesn't trigger you to think about this shit and be kind of pissed off, yeah, you and I don't relate to each other very much. That's all I can say.
Well, on that stellar note, that's where we'll end the episode. Jules, thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much, Rob. All the best.
I think they're all insane.
And one final thing, if you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word and let your friends and family know about it. And also, if you haven't already, make sure you hit subscribe. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button and notification bell. See you next time.